From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus.
Hello and welcome to Middle East Focus, a weekly podcast on regional affairs and U.S. policy, produced by the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. I'm Mohammed Mahmoud, a senior fellow at MEI and the director of the Climate and Water Program. On today's program, we'll be discussing with Athra Khamis her recently completed 3-week expedition to Antarctica and what she observed during her voyage that can serve as warning signs or early indicators of future global climate change. Athra Khamis is a non-resident scholar with MEI's Climate and Water Program. She's a member of the United People Group, the Future Sustainability Leaders Program at Masdar City, and youth forums at the International Renewable Energy Agency in the United Arab Emirates. In her previous role as a research assistant at the University of Sharjah, Athra conducted research work on the effect of climate change on drought to motivate appropriate policy development, and she also explored the role of vegetation on ecosystem response to the disturbance of climate and atmosphere in coastal ecosystems. In addition, one of her research projects won second place in the 2019 Asia Conference on Environment and Sustainable Development in Japan. Welcome to the podcast, Athra.
Thank you, Dr. Mohammed.
So, Athra, I have to ask you the most obvious question first, which is on our topic really today about your expedition to Antarctica. What made you want to visit Antarctica?
Well, I have always been passionate about the environment, climate, and sustainability. But also as an environmental engineer, I have spent years of my life studying, working on climate change between data, analysis, and research, trying to understand it better. But frankly talking, I didn't sense it much, especially in my place here in the UAE. But Antarctica is the place to sense climate change and witness it firsthand on Earth. So I thought sensing and being in the center of climate change will definitely push me to be a better environment and climate activist, a greater researcher. It would empower me to be part of the solution and have a greater impact. And to be honest, I didn't know going to Antarctica is even possible before meeting a couple of amazing personnel who already went to Antarctica. And they have triggered me. Their journeys, stories, and adventures. And what took my mind as the new mindset they came back with. I sensed how Antarctica changed them. They started huge environmental initiative, great efforts they are making, impacting their communities. And that's after coming back from Antarctica. So I knew then that this expedition and this journey to Antarctica is a life changer, and I should definitely go for it.
That's great. And you started to hint at something that was going to lead into my next question, which is if you could elaborate on what capacity that you were able to participate in this Antarctica expedition.
Well, all participants, around 130 participants from 35 nations, we all worked as a team to make this expedition one of a kind. So the organizing foundation have arranged workshops and lectures about sustainability, carbon mitigation, and Antarctic ecosystem. And I was able to participate and be part of those workshops and those activities with top leaders and experts in the field. And on top of it, I took the chance to present my journey in the environmental field with everyone on ship, shared the work I have done so far on sustainability and environmental initiative we have here in the UAE, so everyone can join and be part of, because at the end, we all want to spread the word of sustainability. And I need to mention Masdar Company. They have been huge support to me in this expedition. They have sponsored, supported me throughout the whole trip, prepared me to present youth of the UAE and Middle East and sustainability field. They also engaged me in many events before the expedition, several media contribution, discussion panel after coming back from the journey. So must that have truly expanded my capacity in this expedition.
I think that's great that they were able to provide that opportunity for yourself and for others. So let's talk a little bit about the logistical part of your expedition and essentially the details of the travel route of your journey. If you could share with us and just tell us a little bit more about where did you physically start in your expedition, where you traveled through, and what, the areas that you saw, and then where you finally concluded your expedition.
All right. So it's a very long route. The expedition started from Argentina, city called Ushuaia. It is the farthest point south. They're calling it the end of the world. So I took off from Dubai, the UAE, to Turkey, and then another flight to Sao Paulo, Brazil, and then another stop also on Buenos Aires, Argentina, before I take another internal flight to Ushuaia. So very long layovers between those 4 to 5 stops, I guess. Took me around 48 hours to reach Ushuaia. It sounds really tiring, but believe it or not, I don't remember a moment where I was tired in that journey. I was just taken by the excitement and of what's coming next. So, reaching Ushuaia, we spent 3 days there getting to know the team, having little hikes to prepare ourselves for the coming ones in Antarctica. And then 2 days sailing from Ushuaia to Antarctica. The whole trip was on ship. The ship was basically our home. We used to take these small Zodiac cruise to land on and off to different islands and places in Antarctica and then go back to our ship. So I would say I had the most memorable 10 days of my life on that ship there in Antarctica. And after 10 days, we sailed back to Ushuaia, another 2 days to get back home in Dubai.
Wow, that's quite a journey, not just when you're in Antarctica, but just even to get there and to come back. During your journey, while you were actually there at the continent, did you see any trace of human life while you were there? I think a lot of people might not be able to visualize. Obviously, it's a ice desert landscape, but just sort of the human element, if it is present there. Can you tell us if you were able to see any trace of human life while you were there?
Well, it's a yes and no answer. We didn't see any human being there except for ourselves. But we did see a very old shelter, said to be from the 19th century, where whales trading was a huge industry. Quick background on whales trading. So before the evolution of oil and energy industry, people used to hunt, skin off whales to extract oil from their bones and muscles to illuminate home and businesses back then. So few months back, after a century, we saw the massive amount of whale bones on one of the islands there. And we also saw the trace of oil, the oil processing tanks where unfortunately seals and mammals are living on it. Another thing we saw or human left there was Charcot rock crane that was built by a French explorer called Charcot during his first expedition in the 90s. I think all of this is a history. But we have also spotted one Argentinian research center. It was the first and actually the only building we saw on the trip. But we didn't see anyone or any human being working there, most probably because of the timing, as most research centers work in season, and I believe it's summer usually, and we were there most likely at the end of winter season. So we saw a building, trace of what human left in history, but we couldn't spot any human being.
That's probably nice. At least it gives you a sense of what the land looked like with limited human influence interaction. Gives you more of a, as close as possible as an authentic pre-human intervention. This question really is kind of leading into, I think, the set of questions I think we really want to talk about as it relates to our program, which is shifting to the topic of climate and climate implications. And, we look to Antarctica as sometimes an early indicator of potential impacts of climate change, as what happens in Antarctica could serve as a warning sign elsewhere. So, from your experience, what were some of the first-hand effects of climate change that you observed or witnessed while you were there?
So I would say that our trip to Antarctica was extremely emotional, not because of the breathtaking beauty and the mesmerizing wildlife, but also because of the several climate change effects we have witnessed. First of all, while we were there, Antarctica have witnessed an extreme and unusual heat rise in temperature. It was around minus 10 to minus 11 Celsius, which is really, really cold and freezing. But it's much, much warmer than the seasonal norms by about 40 degree, which is really huge, and it's said to be the largest in history. Another thing, we have witnessed 2 rainy days in a desert-like continent. And we all know that it's abnormal to have rain in Antarctica. We can have, I don't know, snow, ice crystals, any other kind of participation, but definitely not rain. And I still remember how shocked and how terrified everyone was as we couldn't land on those days. We were terrified about how far climate change have come, thinking about what or how future events driven by climate change could be like if we are now experiencing such extreme events. And another warning sign I would like to highlight is the Congo Ice Shelf that collapsed this March. It's almost the size of Los Angeles City, or if I can scale it to the UAE, it's the same size of the total area of Abu Dhabi, Dubai, and Sharjah City all together. And unfortunately, global warming is making events like these more likely. All those events we have witnessed are actually climatic warning signs, telling how fragile and vulnerable Antarctica is to climate change and how it is warming more rapidly than what we thought.
Yeah, that is definitely alarming and cause for concern. Let's link it back to the impacts or effect of climate change on the land, on the physical conditions. Were you able to assess or observe if the wildlife in Antarctica seemed to experience any significant issues because of these impacts of climate change on the continent?
Definitely. Now, beside all the negative effects on whales because of the historical whale trading, the poor seals living on oil and oil tank traces, which is overwhelming, of course, temperature change because of global warming is also killing this wildlife in a way or another. All the fascinating Antarctic wildlife, including whales, penguins, seals, and birds, are depending on krills. And krills are small, tiny shrimp-like crustacean. They're the base of the Antarctic food web and the main food for all the creatures there. So those krills need a dry environment to live and breed, but global warming is increasing the temperature, melting glaciers, causing rain events. And Antarctica is not as cold and as dry as it used to be. Thus, those krill's population have been drastically reduced in the recent years, affecting the whole Antarctic wildlife population, from the bottom level of food chain to the top levels. So all of them have shrinked in population, causing some sort of disorder in the Antarctic ecosystem.
That's significant indeed. It's amazing how a small part of the system if affected, could propagate to the rest of the system. So thanks for sharing that. Based on that and just your other experience, how would you describe how the trip may have changed your perspective on climate change based on what you saw and what you experienced?
So this expedition was an eye-opener. Each workshop I had with the leaders and experts, each discussion I had with a new person coming from a different country that suffers from a different climate change effect added a new perspective or a new meaning to my dictionary. But all of them, we all agree that climate change is happening now. We have always talk about climate change like it's something will happen in the future, and we need to sustain resources for the future and the coming generations. But actually, we need to do that now for our resources today, and we need to have efficient and fast transition. Before the expedition, I was one of the people who believed that energy transition will do take place one day in a slow pace, but I don't actually know when. But after having this experience in Antarctica and witness the climate change effect, I would say that energy transition, clean resources, sustainable living, and definitely carbon removal technologies are essential. Not 50 or 100 years from today, they are essential now. And I believe that we need to discuss and talk more about reversing climate change and not just mitigating it or adapting its effect. Because climate change is accelerating rapidly, and we need to catch this acceleration rate before it's too late.
Very wise words indeed. Thank you for sharing that. We've been talking about, from your perspective, what Antarctica has been experiencing from climate change and other effects. But I want to talk about how the expedition experience has affected you. So looking back at this voyage, if you could share with us maybe more on a human sense from your perspective, what was a real or personal challenge you faced during this very unique expedition?
All right. The challenge was Drake Passage, definitely. It was the biggest challenge I faced. So, in order to reach Antarctica, we need to pass through the Drake Passage, sailing. And it is one, if not the toughest and roughest passages on Earth. Around 20-foot height of swells and waves rocking and rolling the whole time. And honestly, I was one man down with terrible seasickness for 2 continuous days. Pills and patches were barely working on those days. We were hardly moving or having the appetite to eat. So it was just terrible. Then you realize that you're at the end of the world, in the middle of nowhere, no signals, no connections, and you don't really know any single soul with you on the ship. So this was the hardest moment for me where I felt, homesickness, realizing where I am, and seasickness all in the same time. But as we passed the Drake Passage, things started to get better and smoother. We started to get to know each other. All the sickness emotions were replaced by excitement and mesmerism. I came back from Antarctica with an extraordinary experience, lots of insights and memories, and a family of 150 members.
That must have been life-changing in a personal level of just finding the depths of fortitude and strength to overcome physical and just personal challenge. And I'm sure it led to a lot of personal growth. So I appreciate you sharing that level of vulnerability with us on that regard. So I thought my final question to you, and I think you've given us and the listeners a lot of great messages, but if there is one overall message you would like to share to our listeners from what you learned from this experience, what would that final message be?
I would say that climate change is a result of accumulated emission of our daily practices. And I believe that the solution to it could also be an accumulation of thoughtful steps we take. Small steps, small project would definitely make bigger impacts. So let's start thinking about our practices, our carbon footprint, for instance, and try to offset it. Because what we have seen there in Antarctica will not just stay in Antarctica, but will eventually affect the whole planet if we didn't do the necessary. Because Earth, after all, is just one whole ecosystem. So let's try to be more considerate and live more sustainably.
That is a fine message to share. Thank you for that. And thank you, Ada, for sharing your experience and insight from this amazing experience and life-changing expedition.
Thank you a lot for giving me the chance to be here and share my experience with you. It's a pleasure.
That's all the time we have for this week. Thank you to our listeners for tuning in and to our production team for their work on this week's episode. For more information on topics like this, you can follow all of MEI's coverage of climate and water on our website at www.mei.edu. You can also subscribe to Middle East Focus on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other podcast providers. And you can follow MEI on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, and subscribe to our email newsletters for the latest analysis and information about upcoming events. I'm Mohammed Mahmoud. We will see you all next week.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.